And look, Lance, I remembered to record. It only took one bright Post-it note to do that. So it could be just about you. And the idea is that you are on the field every day. It's football season. So let me go with this for a minute. Like, you're out there getting hit, calling plays, making it happen every single day. The idea here is that we just want to pull you off the field for a minute, give you some information, get you inspired, and then we'll send you back into the cruel, hard world. All right. So if you have any questions about that, then I'm sure it's in chat right now, the link to check out more. But we're going to focus now on strategy. And man, I'm so excited to have Dr. Chris Hemler. And he, gosh, I don't even really know where to start. He's just really one of those exceptional people that gives all of us hope, and dedicated to his field, Naval Academy graduate. He's currently teaching in conjunction with that. And you can explain more, Chris, where you're currently teaching. But he is the author of Delivering Destruction. And I'm in the process of reading that book. So he brings such a unique perspective, because when you really look at the word strategy, it has such an interesting history. Now, probably everybody on this call and who will be listening to the recording knows my story more than you ever wanted to. But I'll give you the skinny. I wanted to be a college English teacher until I became a college English teacher. But here's the thing. I love words, and I love to learn the origin of words. And when I started trying to get clear on what strategy meant, what I discovered was it's originated from military terms. And it was one who oversaw, planned large military operations. And I feel like if we can go back to that, there are so many rich principles that we can glean from it. And one of the reasons why I asked Chris to join us today, because this is his wheelhouse. And so not only has Chris studied it, lived it, but he is one of the most amazing storytellers I've listened to. Not too long ago, Lance and I were driving to Shreveport, Louisiana to do a workshop. And we were listening to Chris on a podcast. And even after driving that whole way, battling I-20, and some of you know what that means, you're risking your life headed to Shreveport. But we sat in the parking lot at the hotel because we were hanging on every word. So I'm going to hand it over to Chris, and he's going to have some questions along the way. And I just want you guys to feel free to ask questions as we go, or to comment. And if you don't, then we've got chat open for that purpose also. And the goal is always that we're pouring into you, but then also giving you some tools that's going to help you better lead your team. And so at the end of this, we're going to share one of those that I feel like is so in alignment with how do we get to strategy, but it's a tool that you can use immediately with your team. So thank you, Chris, for being here.
Absolutely, Sherry. Thank you for the invitation. It's really a pleasure to be with you all this morning. We started with some Earth, Wind, and Fire, which was perfect. My 6-year-old daughter loves that song. We play it often in the car. And so that it was a perfect start to the morning. Good morning, everyone. My name's Chris, and I'm really delighted to be with you this morning. I currently teach at the Naval Community College, which is a new effort by the Department of the Navy to educate its enlisted force, the broad naval service, to include the Navy, the Marine Corps, and the Coast Guard. And so it's really a pleasure to work with service members and continue to be in the learning environment, which is an environment I love and an environment that I know is really important to Sherry. So that's why I'm excited to be here today, because I know I'm around fellow learners. I'm around folks that want to keep developing and growing. They're curious about the world. They want to improve their own performance as a leader, and that's something that I'm tremendously passionate about as well. So if I may, Sherry, I'm going to throw my slides up if I can find the share button, and we'll just get right into it. And as we mentioned, please, I hope that this would be an interactive morning for us. So please feel free. Can I get a thumbs up or a confirmation that those slides are up? Thank you, Lance. Appreciate it. But please, I want this to be interactive. We're going to have several reflection points throughout my comments where I would love to hear from you and see what strategic leadership has felt like or meant to you and how you've seen it done well or maybe even poorly. I labeled this talk Enabling Victory because that's what I believe the strategic leader does. They enable victory. They don't achieve victory. That's for the team to do. The strategic leader enables victory. They enable that achievement through the way that they lead, the strategic approach that they take. And specifically today, I'd like to focus on three things that I think strategic leaders ought to do. And we're going to use a historical case study. Sherry invited a historian, so that's what she'll get. We're going to use a historical case study to look at those three things. But I believe that strategic leaders inspire, they employ, and they sustain their people. And we'll dig into each of those words here over the next few minutes. Inspire, employ, and sustain. Notice that none of the words I chose are focused on the actual doing, right? The team is doing, and the leader does a little bit too, but the leader has to be focused on the overarching objectives, the long-term objectives, the pursuit of the team's goals, not so much the day-to-day doing. And that's a really important distinction that I think true strategic leaders either intuitively know or they learn to know that difference between the day-to-day and the strategic vision. So again, the strategic leader is inspiring, employing, and sustaining. To illustrate that point today, I would love to introduce you to Admiral Chester Nimitz, a name I'm sure some of you are already familiar with. He was a World War II admiral and commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. Nimitz was born in 1885 in Fredericksburg, Texas. If you haven't been out to beautiful Fredericksburg, Texas, you've got to book a trip out there. Not only is it wonderful Texas country, in a quaint little town with some German heritage, but it is also home to the National Museum of the Pacific War, which is one of my favorite museums in the country. So Nimitz was born in Fredericksburg, and he initially set his sights on an Army career. We will forgive him for that. After learning that West Point nominations were full for the year, Nimitz decided to take the qualification exam for the Naval Academy. He performed well enough on that exam, and he eventually accepted a nomination to Annapolis and shipped off to Maryland for his undergraduate degree and his commission into the naval service. He graduated in 1905, and he embarked on a career as a surface warfare officer in the surface Navy. But after just 2 years in that direction, Nimitz entered a training program for the submarine service. The submarine service at that time in naval history was a novel but a growing trend within the Navy. And Nimitz spent the next 10 years or so commanding a variety of submarines and then spending some time ashore in important staff billets. He eventually went off to the Naval War College in Rhode Island, where some of the most competitive officers go for quote unquote graduate education in the military service and in the Navy. Then he commanded a Navy ROTC detachment in Southern California, right? So Nimitz is always learning, curious. He's a student of life as he is a student of his profession. And I think that's an important detail to mention. After that ROTC unit, he moves back to an important staff billet in DC. He proves his worth as a senior staff officer, and he earns promotion to Rear Admiral. Then 1941, right, the day that will live in infamy, the Japanese attack at Pearl Harbor on December 7th. Following that attack, Nimitz was hand-selected and ordered to the Pacific, where he took command of the entire American Pacific Fleet. It was in this role that Nimitz would achieve his real fame and then go on to serve as the Chief of Naval Operations, the senior officer in the entire Navy after the war. We're really going to dig into some of the things that Nimitz did while commanding the Pacific Fleet, because I think that was the greatest of his examples in terms of being a strategic leader. And so that's where we'll turn now. Before we jump back to Nimitz, let's pause for a definition, right? The words that we use matter. I think strategic is one, as Sherry mentioned, what you could come up with 1,000 definitions for. I appreciated the definition she shared with us the other day over email, that strategic is the art of the general, right? Remember that word, that rank for a military general comes from being a generalist, being responsible for a variety of things, a diversity of things. You can no longer be a specialist when you're a general in the military. You are responsible for far too much to be an expert in everything. And here the word admiral in the Navy is synonymous with that understanding of general in the Army, traditional Army rank. But here's another definition, I think, to complement the art of the general, which I love so much. Strategic is relating to the identification of long-term or overall aims and interests and the means of achieving them, not the ways of achieving them. The team's going to get to the way, but the means, the resources, the path to achieving those long-term or overall aims and interests. And so I'd love for you to keep those concepts in mind as we talk about strategic leadership today. All right, back to Nimitz. The first thing I want to highlight for you is that inspiration, right? I said that strategic leaders inspire. And Nimitz did this by delegation and through mission type orders. Throughout the Pacific War, Nimitz inspired his troops through highly delegated mission type orders. What do we mean by that? A mission type order, that's some military speak for you. A mission type order emphasizes ends over means. You're giving an order for a team to get to the finish line. You're not necessarily telling them the path to take or the exact actions to execute in the day-to-day. In a mission type order, you're communicating what needs to be accomplished rather than how that thing ought to be accomplished. Nimitz was masterful at this. He resisted telling his troops how, and instead he emphasized the ultimate objective on the journey, the strategic end. This inspired his subordinates because they could execute the mission according to their own judgment and their own expertise. Nimitz's delegation allowed his leaders to emphasize initiative and adaptation, to emphasize frontline decision-making. While specific targets might change in the course of a battle, the strategic ends did not. And that's what Nimitz emphasized for his team. That's what he focused on. I want to draw out an important detail in this approach to leadership. Not only did this allow Nimitz's subordinates broad latitude to exercise their judgment and emphasize their frontline perspective, it also kept Nimitz's attention out of the weeds. He put his trust in his subordinates, and he allowed them to fill in the details of a given plan. That saved Nimitz's energy for the strategic matters. He could focus on the strategic because he had delegated, trusted his subordinates with the details. He could focus on developing his people, securing the resources, removing the obstacles in front of his team, instead of getting involved in the weedy details of a particular attack or operation. This is an important component of strategic leadership. I'd love to pause here for some reflection thoughts and would love for anyone that's willing to share an idea here. Feel free to comment generally, but I've thrown a reflection question here on the screen for us. When or have you experimented with mission type orders where you've left the details to your team, giving them latitude to exercise their own expertise? I'd love for someone, if you're willing, to share a story, it can be good or bad, about mission type orders or delegation to a team.
Hey, Chris, this is Kathy Nato. Can you hear me?
Hey, Kathy, please go ahead.
I'm here in Annapolis with you, so happy that we're in this gloomy day today, but you're brightening it with your good message. I work for another government agency and was working for a chief executive type, and somebody came to me, just somebody off the yard in effect, and said, hey, I got an idea for something, and I thought it was very worthwhile, and I took it to the boss. And the boss says, yeah, run with it. So I turned to the originator of the idea and said, yeah, this is a great idea. Let's start pulling folks from all across the organization together and run with it. And I gave her a few weeks, and she just wasn't moving forward with it. And I wasn't trying to, manage it. I just wanted to say, hey, like, make this thing happen. In the end, I had to take the leadership role from her and give it to another person. So I delegated to another person, kept her on the team because she had ownership in the concept. And we were able to pull off a very successful organization-wide around 3,000 plus civil servants activity a few months later. The person I delegated to had experience in that type of execution, and the person who had the idea did not. So that was my, inspire, employ, and sustain. My idea was just to give this to somebody who had a good idea, but I didn't have enough insight to say that's not really in your wheelhouse to pull this together. But I did have enough to give it to the right person to make it a very successful organization. I really like your strategy definition. It's very helpful to me. Thank you.
Yeah. Kathy, thank you so much for sharing. That was a wonderful illustration of just what we're talking about, right? Finding the right person that appreciates the strategy and the initiative to push that effort forward. And in just a couple moments, we're going to talk about how Nimitz managed relationships, right? Because that's what I heard you doing in that story, Kathy, managing the relationship, finding the right folks and lining them up for the right job. And that's an important part of strategy as well. Thanks so much for sharing. Any other thoughts here? I've got another reflection question for us that we can jump to on this idea of inspiration. Okay, we'll go there next. This is targeted a little bit more at you, the individual leader. Do you, right, realizing this is something Nimitz did so well, do you preserve your time, your energy, and your attention for the strategic matters? Or do you find yourself digging into the weeds of execution and neglecting more strategic efforts? Now we can take this as a rhetorical question. I know that's pretty personal there. I'd love for anyone to share a story if you're willing to in responding to that question, especially if you found a tip or a trick that helps you preserve that energy and that attention for the strategic matters. Any reflections here on preserving your own energy for the strategic?
Hey, Chris, it's Pam.
Yes, Pam, please go ahead.
I work for a national nonprofit, and what we try to do is we try to do quarterly focus days with the team. So at the end of a quarter or at the beginning of a quarter, we allot anywhere from half a day to a full day to look at our accomplishments for the quarter and look to see what's coming up. But we also take time to, I guess what you want to say is dream and just think about the big picture and give room for that. Because to your point, I think we get caught in the weeds and we end up becoming more taskmasters and not having the opportunity to strategize. And it also gives us, it gives the opportunity for all of us to practice that, because I think to your previous point, or I think Kathy had said, someone could come up with the idea, but then it's about the implementation or how do you get to the end goal. So we try to find time to do that. And then on a personal level, I block off my Monday mornings from 8 to 12. It's just blocked on my calendar just to look at what's coming up ahead, but also to process what's happened over the previous week and draw connections and across the organization and try to come up, with some new ideas, because I find I enjoy that and that's what keeps me going. So I really try to block out that time once a week on a Monday morning.
That's awesome, Pam. And such a great idea. It's such a great way to preserve your energy and preserve your focus. I'm a real believer in the power of focus. And I think that's a message that we tend to lose in the 21st century sometimes with the many distractions we've got. That's awesome, Pam. The calendar block, the kind of organizational retreats, those are some of the most powerful moments. The event that Sherry and her team are running in October, right, to preserve your focus and let you reflect. These are the times when those kind of strategic breakthroughs tend to happen, right? But we've got to be disciplined in making that time available. It's so easy to get caught up in the day-to-day. Thanks for sharing that, Pam. Great tip. Anyone else here before we move on? Okay, well, thank you everyone for your participation. It's really, really great to hear from you, Pam and Kathy. Appreciate those contributions. Let's skip along here to the second pillar of Nimitz's strategic leadership. We're going to touch on employ. In employment, Nimitz was incredibly selective in using his team and using military force in the Pacific War. He was selective and then he was concentrated. So let's dig into those words a little bit. This is how Nimitz employed his team strategically. He knew that he had limited resources in the Pacific War, limited time, limited ships, limited troops. He and every other American military commander was constantly asking for more. Are you ever asking for more in your respective leadership roles? I imagine you are, right? If you're anywhere near the average, you probably wish you had more resources too. We almost always do. Here's what Nimitz did about that resource problem in the way that he employed his forces. He built a strategy to honor the limited resources that he had. This is where the Americans got their so-called island hopping strategy of the Pacific War. And as much as I would love to dig into the tactical details of a dozen different battles here with you this morning, that's not what we're going to do. We're going to focus on why Nimitz took that strategic approach, that island hopping approach. In this strategy, American naval forces carefully selected the most important objectives to attack. They then bypassed the targets that had questionable strategic value or simply weren't relevant to the Allies' war plans. If a particular island did not serve the Allies' strategic ends, then it wasn't attacked. It was merely bypassed. This precision allowed American troops to maintain a remarkable tempo in 1944 and 1945 and end the war much faster than really anyone had anticipated during the conflict. They advanced ahead of schedule across the Central Pacific. This allowed Nimitz's troops to spend their precious resources on the right things, spend their ships, their ammunition, and most importantly, in the case of war, their human lives on the right targets, the ones that mattered the most. There was no margin for foolish, nice-to-have objectives, and Nimitz knew that. He didn't waste his team's time on secondary affairs. Now, let's shift to that concentration of force, because although Nimitz was incredibly careful in the targets that he did choose to attack, when he made up his mind, he dedicated tremendous resources to the priority effort. The military calls this concentration of force, placing superior strength at your most important objective, leveraging all of your resources and everything you have. This is the equivalent of going all in at the poker table. This is where you wager on your team. This is what led Admiral Nimitz to commit 4 aircraft carriers, every carrier he had in the summer of 1942, to Midway Island. It was a very risky, a bold move, but it was his bid for victory. And he believed that that's where his team needed to apply their resources. He had been selective in his timing and in his target, but he didn't hold back once he determined a strategic objective. In that case, the gamble paid off handsomely. The United States won one of the most important naval engagements of the war and arguably of history at the Battle of Midway in the summer of 1942. Let's pause to reflect here. Nimitz took his strategic homework very seriously. He analyzed the targets which were essential and strategically promising, and then he dismissed the others. When, for you, has your strategic homework paid off for your team in the past? Again, I would love if anyone is willing to share a thought here. That's okay. Let's try reflection question 2. Maybe this will stir another idea or two. After his strategic homework, Nimitz applied overwhelming force at the critical point of a battle. Can you think of a time when you or a fellow leader that worked for you, worked above you, made a clear decision, even if it was risky, and then threw the team's full weight at that problem? How did that decision go? It doesn't always go the way it did for Nimitz at the Battle of Midway. How did that decision go? Could someone share maybe a story with us here about identifying an investment and then going after it with strategic resources?
Chris, I think I might have an example. You can let me know.
Please, go ahead.
I was working with a company called EDS, and I had 400 trainers flying globally to the 168 countries that we supported. And this was a long time ago, back in the 80s. And I said, there's got to be a better way to do this. And so I created a business case to put some of that training to the desktop. And it was very risky because it hadn't been done. This was a long time before. Now everybody does it, but this day and time, it hadn't been done before. So it was very risky, and I took the risk, and we won all sorts of global awards, and it saved the company millions of dollars to move some of that generic training to the desktop.
That's awesome, Marie. Thank you so much for sharing. What a great story. Do you remember if you don't mind, maybe a follow-up, what did it feel like at the time? Do you remember? What did it feel like to advocate for that approach?
It was a little scary because I didn't have a model to follow. And as Sherry has taught me, it's important to have a model. And I had to create a model and a methodology, and I had to get the right people on the team. And it was fun and exhilarating and scary all at the same time.
Yeah, that's great. Well, I imagine Nimitz felt many of those emotions as he was leading his team through some of these decisions, and that's how they're going to feel sometimes. You were ahead of your time, Marie, as I think they say, ahead of your time. Thanks so much for sharing.
Hey, Chris, one thing that I was thinking,
Yep.
and Marie, especially as you were talking, this is such a challenge, I think, for so many of us and so many of the leaders we work with, because there's so many, everything's a priority, and there's so many initiatives. To me, this is just reinforcing the importance of kind of the 80-20, and then of really prioritizing, spending that time as you're, strategic mapping and knowing when, gosh, like, where you have opportunities to push back or to set some better boundaries. Because I just know, like, so many of the leaders we work with, the number of initiatives is mind-blowing. And this explains why you may be feeling that overwhelm or burnout, or feel like you're not, getting the results that you could get. So to me, this is just reinforcing the importance of being selected, and then really concentrated force is just a great term.
All right, we will move along here. I agree with you, Sherry. Selective and concentrated force. So I encourage you to add that to your lexicon if you haven't encountered those phrases before. But Nimitz was very selective in identifying the objective, but once he made a determination, he used concentrated force. He threw everything he had at the problem. And I think that's a really, really valuable, profound application of a strategic leader. Okay, final pillar here. We want to touch on sustaining his team. I would argue that the most important aspect of Nimitz's strategic leadership was actually his character and just his general approach to how he led a team. His character not only sustained the naval forces that he led, in many ways, it sustained the entire alliance of the American services in the Pacific, the Army, the Navy, and the Marine Corps. Nimitz was an incredibly collaborative leader, much more so than other leaders of his time. He was willing to reach across service lines that could include political and tension, and kind of jockeying for position within the American military services. And Nimitz was collaborative. He was also personable and a very empathetic leader. This comes through in every biography written about Nimitz. He was masterful with his subordinates. In every conversation and in every meeting, Nimitz was genuinely interested in what his team had to say. He solicited their input. In fact, he demanded it in order to frame his problems and develop his decisions. Nimitz had extraordinary interpersonal skills. He could address conflict directly, but with tremendous compassion and empathy. He seemed to be able to balance the accountability of the military profession with a warmth and a confidence of a proud parent or a close friend. Somehow he kept these characteristics in coexistence in the way that he led. I'd encourage you to think of maybe a coach that believed in you early in your life, maybe later in your life, maybe now, someone that was all in, fighting for you and in your corner. That was Nimitz. That was the way that he led his team. He achieved far more by encouraging and inspiring his people than he did in ordering or dictating to them in the way that we might think of a traditional general or admiral. He celebrated the achievements of his team, and he always put his subordinates' success ahead of his own. I'll give you one example, and I'm borrowing this reference from historian Trent Hone's excellent biography on Nimitz. Just before the Battle of Midway in 1942, which I referenced a few minutes ago, one of Nimitz's best admirals, William Bull Halsey, fell ill, and Nimitz had to reshuffle the roster, if you will, heading into the Battle of Midway. He decided to place Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher into tactical command. Here's the thing with Fletcher, though, and this is what took some delicate leadership on the part of Nimitz. Fletcher, just a few months before, had performed rather poorly at the Battle of Coral Sea. He'd made some poor decisions, and he had actually stirred the ire of the Chief of Naval Operations, again, the senior naval officer in the entire service, Ernest King. He'd stirred his ire through his performance at Coral Sea. Fletcher had divided his forces in a rather foolish way and acted a bit rashly on the intelligence that he had a few months earlier. In order to restore that confidence, Nimitz still believed that Fletcher was the man for the job. But in order to restore that confidence, he had to coach Fletcher out of this disappointing performance at Coral Sea. He had to hold him accountable and tell him that the boss was disappointed, but he also had to encourage him and restore his spirit going into arguably one of the most important naval engagements of the entire war. Nimitz was the right man for that job. He restored Fletcher's confidence. He struck that balance between accountability and inspiration. And Fletcher performed admirably at the Battle of Midway and was another of the key ingredients of American success there. So I'd ask you to reflect here again. When have you seen a leader maintain accountability and yet also remain warm and encouraging and empathetic toward their colleague or their subordinate? And what was the result of that balance that the leader was striking? Have we seen that done before? Any reactions here? That's okay. That's okay. Well, I promise you it's hard, right? I would bet that if you think of a story later today or later this week that maybe rhymes with what Nimitz did here, it was probably hard to do, right? To strike that accountability and that grace and that compassion in the same type of conversation. It's always tough. But this is something that Nimitz truly excelled at, and it allowed him to take his team to its greatest heights. But I think that's really what a strategic leader does. They have to maintain accountability. Kathy was telling us about that earlier, finding the right person for the job. Sometimes changes have to be made, but the strategic leader does it in the right way, where they can maintain confidence and trust and encouragement within the organization such that they can move forward after a difficult battle or a difficult moment. Let's turn to a quick conclusion before we wrap up. One last look here. Nimitz was an extraordinary strategic leader because he did three things, or I should say at least three things. that focused on long-term objectives and the conditions or the circumstances that would make his team successful. First, he inspired his junior officers and his sailors by delegating to them through mission-type orders. He trusted them to accomplish the task through their own talents and their own expertise. And maybe most importantly, that preserved his energy for the strategic matters. Second, Nimitz was selective in employing his units. Like every one of us, he had limited resources and limited time. He had to prioritize the most important things. He could not expect his team to do everything all at once. There is an important corollary here, though. When he did identify a critical undertaking or a priority effort, he threw everything he had at that challenge, and he let his subordinates know that they were going all in on that particular effort. Finally, Nimitz sustained his team with selfless leadership and character. His style was much more that of a personal coach than a self-absorbed prima donna. He was warm, he was empathetic, he was completely invested in the success of his team. I will quote I'll end with a quote from one of my favorite biographers and a historian of Nimitz. He wrote toward the end of his book, Nimitz at War, he wrote, quote, "Nimitz's greatness lay less in his ability to do great things than in his facility to convince others that they could do great things." I think that this is Nimitz's true legacy from the Pacific War, and it is indeed the essence of an effective strategic leader. Thank you so much for the invitation to join you today. I'm not sure if we've got time for conversation and dialogue, but I would love to engage in whatever time we've got left, and I'll hand it back to Sherry at this point.
Yes, so good. I could just listen forever. It's so inspiring. I wanted to just say that we've got one thing that you may find helpful, because delegation is a really big part of this. And so after about 20 years of listening to leaders on coaching calls and working in workshops and identifying where the biggest hiccups happen in delegation, we decided, look, it only took us like 20 years to figure that out. Just to put it into a blueprint. It's a simple blueprint, but I can guarantee you these are the 5 areas where we tend to struggle when it comes to delegation. So it's free. You can click on there, download it. I've got a couple of little videos with it just to explain each one. Goes right back to the whole idea of finding the right person to delegate to, but there's so many little nuances that if we can get better at delegating, it does free up the time to do the strategic work, which is probably the thing that your team is depending on you to do. And anytime we say yes to all these other distractions or things other people could be doing, we're essentially saying no to the strategic work that we are responsible for doing. So anyway, that's a tool that you can have. You can just click on the link, it's in chat, et cetera, et cetera. But I want to just ask, I'm just going to stop my share for a second. What questions do you guys have for Chris? I mean, I have a list, but I'll let you go first. So my top of the list, I can't help it, but you've studied his life. What were his does he have a #1 influence in how he learned these things? Like, was there a someone in his experience that modeled that in any way as you've looked at his life?
That's a really good question. I regret that I'm not a biographer of Nimitz, right? I'm a huge fan of him. So I would point you to two excellent biographies. One is by the historian I mentioned at the end there, Craig Simons, just a few years ago, published Nimitz at War. And then there's also Trent Hohn's wonderful book. It's titled Mastering the Art of Command, which I think is just such a fitting title for Nimitz. Because Sherry, your definition of strategic, right? The art of the general, that's what Nimitz mastered, was that it's an art, not just strategy. I think leadership is an art, right? There aren't any formulaic answers, right? If there was an equation, we would all get it right and we'd go home. But it's an art. It's more difficult than that. So I'm pointing you to two of the best books. I don't know who the single most influential leader was for Nimitz. I can't answer that, but I know that he was a student throughout his life, and maybe that's the generic answer I would give you, that he was never done learning. Right, he commanded an ROTC unit. He went off to the Naval War College. He just had a humility that he was never done developing. And I think that might be another, maybe that's in the appendix of my comments today is that the strategic leader's never done growing and developing. I know that's a message, Sherry, that you put out loud and clear in your work.
Yeah, that's really, really great. Maybe next year, maybe we do our Leading Lab Live in Fredericksburg. What do you guys think about that? That'd be fun. Then we could go to the museum. They have a
Tell me
couple
the
of
date. I'll be there.
Sure.
I'm in. Just don't make it during the heat of the summer in Fredericksburg, please.
You are so right, man. It is sweltering heat for sure.
I was thinking we could do it in Annapolis and Chris could take us on a tour of
the yard. That would be awesome too.
Annapolis is beautiful in October.
We like all that. Love it. Well, we always hang on an extra few minutes, but I want to just one more time. You're right. Everybody on this call, especially most people that we work with, they are just lifelong learners. And it's so exciting to get a new insight and to have meaningful conversation because it's so easy to get caught up in the day-to-day. And so if there's any possible way that you can get there on Friday, October the 18th, it's going to be a day of, let's just say it won't be a sit and soak, okay? You're going to be involved. We've got phenomenal speakers talking about technology, talking about your own health and wellness. Amen Clinics is going to be there. Amen Clinics is just at the cutting edge of taking a look at the brain and then treating it based on what they see, which I know sounds kind of duh, but how many things are we taking away related to mental health and without ever looking at the equipment that you're dealing with? And so Amen Clinics is just incredible. And then we wrap it up with a story of two young girls. Well, I say that, I think they literally were around 22, 23, who saw this massive need in the Philippines about, I don't know how far away it is. It's a 15-hour plane ride. I can tell you that. It's a long one. To go into a culture they knew nothing about and establish this incredible life-changing organization. And so just a lot of different dimensions, but really the common theme is the importance of following your calling, of loving your life, of leading very intentionally, always learning new tools, new ways, getting greater awareness of our own blind spots, super important. And then essentially leaving a legacy. And that's what we're working so hard to do, is to really pour into people that can then pour into people that can then pour into people. And I think I'm going to do a little research on Nimitz, like was there a number one guide for him? I think it'd be interesting to hear. So guys, we always hang on extra time, but I know a lot of you have 9 o'clock starting and the world is waiting on you. So go.
So Sherry, real
out there,
quick,
make a difference.
Cody has a great question for you
yeah, sure.
and/or Chris. If y'all, it's in chat. And for those of you who don't have chat, I'll read it. What I find in many leaders is they simply won't get out of the weeds, which is true. We have a lot of coaching calls that, hey, I'm in the weeds. Well, I mean, you chose to go into the weeds. So, but he's asking more about, is there a question that you can ask or ways to get them to see how they're getting in their own way?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'll jump in briefly. It's a great question, Cody. My quick answer is to hold them accountable to the strategic. I think that's the first thing you can do is hold them accountable to the strategic and let them see for themselves that the tactical level, right, the ground level, the weedy details are siphoning their energy and taking away from the strategic investment. So whether that's commenting on a strategy that you're developing, or pushing into a new product. I'm not sure what your sector is, Cody, but if you hold your leaders accountable to the strategic, I think this is the best way to get their attention in the right place and help them to realize that those tactical, low level details are making their job harder. That's one practical way to do it that I'd encourage you to try out. It's tough. It's tough, right? Because these leaders are go-getters. And I think maybe many on this call can empathize that you've gotten to a position where you're in a leadership position in many ways, probably because you're a go-getter. You get things done. You look into the details. You follow up with the efforts. I think to get to that strategic level, you have to take a perspective shift, and it's tough.
Yeah, I think that, and it's scary. When Chris asking Marie about what was that like? Do you remember what that felt like? It probably was scary as hell, right? Because that the thing is that the weeds, that's also what I'm comfortable with. That's what I'm confident in. But to be a strategic leader means you got to grapple with the unknown. You got to make friends with the unknown and the unfamiliar, and your brain is going to freak out. It will throw every crazy failure story that you can imagine. But in time, it's like any other muscle. It's about growing in that confidence to be out there knowing that maybe not every decision is going to get you the desired result, but then you make a different decision. So, that's a great question, Cody. Love it.
Yeah, because it really boils down to redefining what success looks like in your role. And I'm sure, Chris, with, when you think about, a lot of these folks that moved up in ranks, it was, some succeeded, some didn't, because, their success was leading a, battalion, winning the island versus you kind of putting people into place and going, well, I'm so used to being in, because that's how I defined my success. I was rewarded by the being in the weeds. And so it is hard for up and coming leaders to redefine what success looks like.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, Lance. And it matches what Sherry just told us, that you can't get stuck in the familiar and the comfortable and what you used to do, right? Answering another email might feel like the easy thing, but it's probably not what you need to do as the strategic leader. You need to launch the new blueprint. You need to think about the future of the organization. You need to think about the values that you're trying to espouse. I mean, you've got other things than answering. It doesn't mean we can ignore our inbox. I wish we could, but get out of the comfortable and the familiar. Exactly, Lance. As these leaders moved up to continue with the World War II example, they had to change that perspective. And if they couldn't, they weren't going to be successful in those more strategic positions.
Well, Chris, thank you. And I don't know about you guys, but it is really causing me to reevaluate. I'm going to spend some time after this and look at my calendar. Like, it's so easy to talk about what everybody else is doing, but we got to turn that mirror around and say, all right, what did this show up today to teach me? Maybe resetting some of that. So I just can't thank you enough, Chris. Thank you. And we'll have this recording. We'll send it out, because you might be thinking, oh, somebody that I work with could benefit from hearing this. We'll share it with them. That's what we're here to do, is to just come together and explore topics and then share the learning with other people. So I appreciate every single one of you so much. Hope to see you on October 18th. And if not, we will miss you desperately. So I'm going to stop my recording. And